they do not recognize within themselves, they unconsciously recruit others to bear it for them. Think for a moment. How many times have you left a conversation feeling drained and confused, unable to name what just happened? How often have you been turned into the villain of someone else's story, the caretaker of pain that wasn't yours, the scapegoat of unspoken resentments? Jung called this projection one of the most insidious mechanisms of the unconscious. The moment someone projects onto you what they cannot face within themselves, you cease to be seen as a person. You become a symbol, a container, a psychological screen upon which they cast their disowned fears, desires, guilt, and shame. And the most unsettling part? You may never realize it's happening. You believe you're being kind. You call it empathy. You think you are helping. But what you are really doing is merging into someone else's psychic labyrinth. You begin to solve problems that aren't yours, carry emotions that do not belong to you, and navigate relational landscapes designed by the unconscious of another. This is how you begin to lose yourself, not in a violent rupture, but in a slow erosion of your own psychic center. And it is not only the overtly toxic who carry this danger. Jung warned us that the most destructive forces do not stem from those who consciously intend harm, but from those who are most dissociated from themselves. These are not inherently evil people. They are fragmented. They are dominated by complexes they do not recognize, traumas they have buried, and archetypal roles they perform without awareness. Their threat lies in the silence, in the subtle comments, the veiled guilt, the long pauses, the glances that make you question your worth. They erode you slowly until you forget what your own truth feels like, and once that happens, you no longer stand in your own soul, you stand in theirs. Perhaps you find yourself in such a dynamic right now. Perhaps it's in your marriage, your friendships, your workplace, or your own family. And perhaps you are blaming yourself, asking, what is wrong with you? The answer is nothing. But there is something profoundly wrong with being cast as the vessel for another's unconscious burdens. In this journey, we will illuminate 6 psychological profiles that Jung would have deemed emotionally hazardous, not because they intend harm, but because they are animated by inner forces they have not yet confronted. But more importantly, we will explore how to recognize these profiles not only in others, but within ourselves. For we are all susceptible to the unconscious. No one is exempt. So take a breath and proceed with courage, but know this. Once your eyes are open to the invisible forces that shape human behavior, you will never again look at another or yourself in the same way. Imagine sharing your life with someone who makes you feel responsible for emotions that were never yours to carry. At first they appear delicate, sensitive, even soulful, someone whose depth draws you in. But over time, something shifts. Their fragility becomes a burden, their emotions a labyrinth, and you, without realizing it, find yourself entangled in a psychic war that did not begin with you, yet somehow you are already losing. This is the silent terrain of the unconscious manipulator, an individual who, unable to face their own inner fragmentation, casts their pain outward in search of a container. And often, that container is you. Carl Jung once said, "What we do not confront in ourselves, we will encounter as fate." And this fate is rarely abstract. It wears faces, speaks your name, shares your table, sleeps beside you. The unconscious manipulator is not inherently cruel. They are ruled by repressed wounds, emotional fragments buried so deeply they no longer recognize them as their own. Instead of turning inward, they turn you into a mirror, a screen upon which their unacknowledged pain plays itself out. To them, you are not you. You are a symbol, a vessel, a scapegoat. Jung explained that projection is a natural function of the psyche. Everyone does it. But when left unchecked, unexamined, it becomes not just a defense, it becomes a distortion. In the ego and the unconscious, he warned that projection causes a kind of psychic blindness, a dangerous narrowing of perception, where others are no longer seen as they are, but as reflections of what remains unintegrated in us. This is the essence of the unconscious manipulator. They do not see the person before them, They see a disowned part of themselves and react to that shadow as though it were external reality. Often, this dynamic is cloaked in victimhood. Their pain is always someone else's doing, their anger always provoked, their sadness always triggered by your failure, their inferiority always justified by your supposed superiority. And because the manipulation is not loud, not direct, not intentional, it works. You begin to question yourself. Was I too harsh? Did I miss something? Am I the problem? Slowly, invisibly, you begin to doubt your own emotional reality. And that is the power of the unconscious manipulator. They do not manipulate with coercion, but with suggestion, not with violence, but with subtle distortion. Their charisma, their emotional sensitivity, their intensity, it makes you believe you can help them, perhaps even heal them. But what is actually happening is a slow erosion of your inner clarity. You begin to abandon your psychic well-being for the illusion of rescuing someone who refuses to confront themselves. And the harder you try, the deeper you descend into their shadow. Jung warned us that this archetype is perilous because it assigns symbolic roles to real people. Roles like savior, villain, traitor, or surrogate parent. But these are illusions. In such relationships, you are no longer perceived as a human being. You become a projection, a symbolic character in their internal drama. And to remain there is to live a lie. The first step toward liberation is awareness. You must learn to pause and ask, is this feeling mine, or was it implanted? You must sever the psychic cords that bind you to narratives not born of your soul. Because the unconscious manipulator does not enter through aggression, they enter through your empathy. They use your kindness as a doorway. And once you recognize this pattern, the danger does not vanish. It evolves. It often hides more deeply beneath a refined mask, the persona. In the next section, we will step into this shadow domain, where a person no longer just projects, but builds their entire life around appearing as something they are not. While the manipulator casts their shadow onto you, the bearer of the persona tempts you to lose yourself entirely in the illusion of who you believe you must become. And in Jung's eyes, this is a psychological danger far more seductive and far more devastating. Not all psychological danger comes masked in chaos or overt dysfunction. Sometimes it arrives dressed in perfection, in the polished smile, in the rigid grace of impeccable manners, in the polished surface that reflects everything except truth. We live in an age obsessed with appearances, where seeming is mistaken for being, and it is precisely this confusion that Jung regarded as one of the most subtle and corrosive dangers of the psyche. When a person fuses too tightly with their persona, the social mask constructed to navigate collective life, they do not simply play a role, they begin to forget who they are beneath it. And worse, they begin to shape others in the image of their performance. In The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung writes, the persona is what someone is not, but what he and others think he is. It is a fabrication, not inherently evil, but hollow when mistaken for the whole self. The persona, by design, serves a purpose. It allows us to fulfill roles, to move through society as parent, teacher, friend, citizen, but it is meant to be worn lightly, like a garment, not fused to the flesh. The danger begins when the mask becomes the face, when the individual forgets the soul that exists behind it. The bearer of the persona becomes a master of controlled surfaces. They say what is expected. They behave impeccably. They excel at diplomacy, avoid conflict, and radiate composure. But behind the elegant choreography of their outer self lies a soul suffocating in silence. For every ounce of image they uphold, a pound of authenticity is repressed. And repression, Jung warned, is never neutral. It is a wound wrapped in ritual. It demands payment. Eventually, to those who live with or around such a person, something always feels slightly off. You sense the absence of spontaneity, the chill of disconnection, the echo of rehearsed responses. Nothing seems wrong, and yet nothing feels real. The air becomes thick with performance. The bearer of the persona not only insists on their own perfection, but unconsciously imposes it on you as well. They expect you to conform to the script, to mirror the image. Show too much feeling, ask a question too deep, express a truth too raw, and they withdraw, shut down, recoil, not because they dislike you, but because you have touched a part of them they have long buried. Jung saw this as one of the gravest obstructions to individuation, the sacred process of becoming whole. He warned that the greatest peril lies in believing the role you play is who you are. For in that belief you become captive to your own reflection. You sacrifice soul for applause, and what is truly alive in you, the instinctive, the messy, the honest, dies a slow death behind the polished mask. Living with someone trapped in the persona can be spiritually disorienting. You begin to measure your words, dilute your feelings, second-guess your authenticity. You may start to wear a mask of your own without realizing it. This is the contagion of persona. Its artificiality is not merely alienating, it spreads, like smoke from a fire that no one dares acknowledge. But deeper still lies a more dangerous truth. The persona does not dissolve what it hides. It only delays it. And the emotions repressed beneath its surface, the rage, the longing, the fear, the shame, do not vanish. They descend into the unconscious, fermenting into shadow. And when the weight of denial becomes too great, that shadow does not whisper, it erupts. In the next section, we will confront the figure that emerges from this internal pressure, the one who represses their darkness until it explodes. The owner of the repressed shadow, the one who, in rejecting their inner truth, becomes a vessel for psychic volatility. A danger not only to themselves, but to those who dare stand too close. There exists a kind of individual whose outer life appears poised, polished, even pristine. Their gestures are measured, their tone polite, their conduct irreproachable. They are the embodiment of control, moderation, and self-restraint. But beneath this carefully constructed surface lies a pressure building in the unconscious, a subterranean chamber of unacknowledged drives, impulses, and truths that refuse to remain buried forever. This is the archetype of the one who carries the repressed shadow, not one who has conquered their darkness, but one who has buried it, only to be ruled by it in silence. This is not transformation. It is repression masquerading as virtue. It is a performance of perpetual light that suppresses every flicker of darkness until the dark begins to speak in eruptions. Carl Jung devoted much of his life's work to this very phenomenon. In Ion, he writes, "The shadow is everything that the individual refuses to recognize in themselves, and yet insists on manifesting in some way. The shadow is not the villain from the outside world, it is the unclaimed within. It is the hatred disguised as moral indignation, the jealousy cloaked in criticism, the sexuality hidden beneath propriety, the ambition repackaged as humility. These parts do not disappear by rejection. They descend into the unconscious and wait. And as Jung so clearly warned, what you do not make conscious directs your life, and you call it fate. The one who represses their shadow is rarely seen as dangerous at first glance. They are often admired, disciplined, composed, even noble. But there is something you feel but cannot name. They recoil at weakness. They are disturbed by vulnerability. They tense at spontaneity. They do not explode. Until they do. And when they do, the eruption is not a simple expression of frustration. It is the fury of years of emotional exile breaking through a wall too fragile to contain it. This person is caught in a state of chronic internal surveillance. They police their own impulses with ruthless severity and, in turn, judge others for what they themselves fear to feel. They do not tolerate their own imperfection, and so they project disdain onto others who dare to be human. They become rigid, moralistic, overly demanding, constructing an internal regime not to thrive but to suppress, and the deeper this suppression goes, the more violent its return. As Jung explained, the stronger the persona, the more repressed the shadow, and the more brutal its manifestation. You recognize this archetype in people whose emotional reactions are disproportionate, who erupt over trivial matters, who silently punish others for perceived slights, who sabotage intimacy not through confrontation, but through coldness, distance, and passive aggression. These are the difficult people. The ones whose bitterness confounds reason, whose resentment outlives context, whose criticism feels like poison dipped in civility. But the source of that poison is not cruelty. It is unprocessed shadow, ignored, unloved, unseen. And here lies the paradox that Jung never ceased to highlight. The shadow is not composed solely of what is vile or shameful. It is also made of gold, of unlived passion, repressed brilliance, silenced instincts, and the sacred fire of authenticity. But when denied, these gifts turn toxic. And that toxicity bleeds into relationships, corrodes families, and contaminates the soul of the one who carries it. To live with someone possessed by the repressed shadow is to walk through an emotional minefield. One misstep, one honest emotion, one stray truth, and you find yourself caught in an explosion you did not ignite. Yet this inner volatility rarely arises in isolation. It is often fueled by a sense of superiority, a moral armor that disguises fragility as righteousness. Here, guilt becomes a weapon, control becomes a creed, and judgment becomes a refuge from one's own unmet longings. And that brings us to the next figure in Jung's map of inner danger. The moral controller. Not merely one who denies desire, but one who weaponizes your freedom to preserve their illusion of control. A soul who not only buries their own truth, but punishes you for daring to live yours. Not every executioner holds a weapon in their hand. Some wield creeds, others brandish dogma, and many cloak their control in the language of righteousness. Their tools are not swords, but commandments, polished phrases, and holy intentions. These are the moral controllers, the guardians of propriety, who, beneath the facade of virtue, are trapped in a prison of their own unresolved guilt. Carl Jung warned us that when morality becomes a mask, it ceases to be ethical. It becomes a psychic defense. One of the most dangerous forms of repression the soul can construct. The moral controller is not simply someone who lives by rules. They are someone who externalizes the war they refuse to fight within. Instead of integrating their shadow, they cast it outward and condemn it in others. You have likely met such a person. They often appear noble, unwavering, principled. They speak in absolutes and wield judgment as if it were sacred. But beneath this image lies fragility, an ego terrified of facing its own contradictions. These individuals need to be seen as morally superior because they are unable to sit with the imperfection within themselves. And so, as Jung described, the greater the repression, the more intense the projection. What they cannot accept in their own nature must be hunted and punished in the outside world. To the moral controller, others become sinners, deviants, corrupted. Not because they are, but because that image keeps the illusion of purity intact. But unlike a typical manipulator, the moral controller believes they are saving you. They truly think they are helping, guiding, correcting. This is what makes their influence so devastating, because their control is draped in the language of concern. Their condemnation arrives with phrases like, "It's for your own good," or "One day you'll thank me." But the truth they offer is not truth. It is a projection, distorted, filtered, weaponized. Jung explored this archetype at length in Ion, describing the symbolic conflict between Christ and the Antichrist, between the image of wholeness and its unconscious disassociation. The moral controller imagines themselves as an agent of light, yet remains blind to the darkness they carry. They disown their shadow by projecting it violently onto others. In their universe, they are always on the side of good, and anyone who resists becomes an embodiment of evil. This spiritual inflation is perilous. It leads to blindness, intolerance, and psychic violence disguised as virtue. If you live in the orbit of such a person, you may begin to feel perpetually wrong. You feel as though you're under a microscope, judged not for your actions, but for your essence. Even your joy begins to feel guilty. Your spontaneity begins to shrink. You contort yourself to fit their image of right, repressing what is alive, true, and natural within you. This is how the morality of another becomes your psychological cage. Slowly, invisibly, your soul bends under the weight of their ideal. This pattern is deeply embedded in families, religious institutions, and environments where obedience is mistaken for goodness. And Jung saw this as one of the most insidious threats to individuation, the sacred journey of becoming whole. Where rigid morality reigns, self-acknowledge dies. The extreme moralist does not seek truth, they seek control, and when they cannot control the outer world, they begin reshaping the inner world of those closest to them. Yet even they are not the most unstable figures in Jung's gallery of psychological danger, because while the moral controller represses and projects, there is another who is ruled entirely by what lies beneath, the complexed individual. Their psyche is not armored, it is hijacked. In the next section, we step into even more volatile territory, where unconscious trauma gains full dominion over the personality, where the ego no longer hides the shadow, but is swallowed by it entirely. Imagine sharing your life with someone who, in one moment, wraps you in warmth, tenderness, and generosity, only to turn the next moment into a battlefield of sudden silence, accusations, or inexplicable rage. A gesture of affection becomes an act of threat. A kind word hides a hidden demand. You begin to live not in presence, but in anticipation, measuring every word, second-guessing every gesture, because at any moment the ground beneath you might erupt. This is not ordinary conflict. This is what it means to live in the orbit of someone overtaken by unconscious complexes. Carl Jung defined complexes as autonomous fragments of the psyche, clusters of feeling-toned memories that break off from the conscious whole and form their own emotional identities within the unconscious. In Psychological Types and the Ego and the Unconscious, he described them as inner figures with their own voice, their own agenda, capable of seizing control of a person's behavior without their awareness. When such a complex is activated, the individual ceases to respond to the present moment and instead relives an old psychic wound, an abandonment, a betrayal, a humiliation long buried but never healed. And it is not the original wound that bleeds, it is you who bleeds in their place. What makes this dynamic so disorienting is its inconsistency. One moment they are loving, sincere, even remorseful. The next, they are triggered, taken over by something ancient and irrational. This emotional whiplash becomes its own form of bondage. You begin to believe the highs are real, that if you are just careful enough, kind enough, quiet enough, the lows might disappear. But they don't. They return, always unannounced, and each return chips away at your center. Over time, you change. You silence your truth to avoid triggering theirs. You begin to tiptoe around their inner minefield, avoiding topics, changing tones, shrinking to fit into the safe zones of their instability. You become hyper-vigilant. But here lies the cruel irony. The monster you are trying not to awaken is not asleep because of your silence. It is already awake. You did not summon it. It lives there, latent, volatile, and always scanning for a reason to erupt. And no matter how much you adjust, it finds one. Jung warned us that complexes behave like independent beings. They hijack the psyche and speak, feel, and act in place of the individual. In the complexed person, this psychic takeover becomes a pattern, a cycle. One might be possessed by a complex of martyrdom, persecution, inferiority, abandonment. Each has its own mythology, and you unknowingly are cast into its roles. And the more you try to soothe the storm, the more entangled you become in the unconscious drama, not of your making. Eventually, you begin to lose your own center. You start to question yourself. Did I cause this? Did I say something wrong? Is this my fault? You begin to forget your own emotional compass because theirs consumes the space. Slowly, without realizing it, you are no longer merely witnessing their fragmentation, you are becoming part of it. Their unresolved past becomes the gravity that distorts your present. And yet the danger does not end here, for while the complex person storms through emotional highs and lows, there is another figure Jung warned us about. Quieter, calmer, and even more draining. They do not lash out, they do not explode, they simply absorb you, feed on your light, deplete your spirit without ever raising their voice. In the next and final section, we will explore the most silent danger of all, the psychic vampire, the one who feeds not on conflict but on connection, and in doing so drains the life from your soul without ever seeming to take anything at all. Some people do not seek your presence, they hunger for your energy, not in ways that are loud or obvious, but through an invisible tether that tightens over time. They come not with weapons, but with sighs, not with attacks, but with endless needs wrapped in the language of closeness. Their tools are not force, but fatigue. Carl Jung never used the term psychic vampire, but in his writings he described their essence precisely. This figure is the living embodiment of an unresolved symbiotic bond, the entanglement of two souls that have failed to distinguish where one ends and the other begins. In The Ego and the Unconscious and Iron, Jung warns that the gravest threat to individuation, the path of becoming a whole self, is this very psychic fusion, where the contours of identity dissolve under the weight of unexamined need. The psychic vampire does not grow beside you. They grow into you. They don't ask you to walk with them. They expect you to carry them. First, you offer empathy, then time, then bits of your soul. What begins as support quietly becomes sacrifice. And what is sacrificed ultimately is your sense of self. You begin to forget where your joy ends and their sorrow begins, where your silence begins and their anxiety echoes through it. You are not just tired, you are spiritually malnourished. There is a quiet erosion happening within, not of your body, but of your very being. Jung saw this dynamic clearly. When an individual lacks psychic nourishment from within, they unconsciously attach themselves to another in order to feed, not through malice, but through inner emptiness. As harsh as it sounds, they become emotional parasites, not because they are evil, but because they have not yet found the courage to face the hollowness within. They do not want healing, they want to be sustained. And in that need, they will drink from your well until it runs dry. But the true danger lies beyond the depletion. It lies in the disintegration of your own center. You begin to question whether your desire for space is selfish, whether your fatigue is a flaw, whether your longing for silence is a sin. You feel guilty for closing your door, guilty for reclaiming your own time, your own breath, because the psychic vampire is a master of inversion. They do not attack, they invert. First the helpless one, then the wounded soul, then, suddenly, the accuser. They will call you cold, detached, distant, ungrateful, and you will begin to wonder if it is true. This is how the slow erosion becomes complete, not only of your energy, but of your inner compass. You are no longer living for yourself, you are surviving for them. You mold yourself not from love, but from fear. Fear of conflict, fear of collapse, fear that they might unravel if you stop holding them up. But Carl Jung reminds us again and again, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And this truth does not only apply to others, it applies to ourselves. Because in the web of psychic entanglement, we too must look in the mirror. Perhaps we have once, unknowingly, drained others in our own emptiness. Perhaps we have clung, performed or projected instead of processing. None of us is immune. We are all hosts of shadow and bearers of unresolved longing. The difference is not between good and bad, healthy or broken. It is between those who look inward and those who bleed outward. Between those who dare to witness their own unconscious and those who make others carry it. The true act of awakening is not in avoiding these dynamics, but in recognizing them, in naming them, and in finally saying no to the patterns that fragment your soul. This journey has not merely been informational, it has been initiatory. What you have just witnessed is not a video, but a mirror held to the unconscious fabric of your relationships, a symbolic descent into the subtle but potent forces that entangle, wound, and keep us from our true center. If you've come this far, it means something within you is stirring, something ancient, resilient, and ready. You are not here by accident. You are here because the psyche, weary of invisibility, has called you back to the place of inner reckoning. This is where real liberation begins, not with accusation, not with casting blame on the world outside, but with a sacred refusal to remain captive to unconscious roles. Jung taught that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. To awaken is not to hate those who harmed you. It is to step out of the shadow, play, to unhook from the web of projection, to reclaim the territory of your own mind, heart, and soul. Freedom does not roar. It whispers. It begins in the quiet moment when you see clearly, perhaps for the first time, the invisible scripts you've been living by, and choose to stop. It is the moment you drop the emotional burdens that were never yours to carry. The moment you say, this dynamic ends with me, not from vengeance, but from vision, not from rage, but from realization. That is what Jung meant by individuation, not perfection, but wholeness, a return to the self no longer fragmented by others' unspoken wars. And so, this is your threshold, not an ending, but a beginning. The fact that you now recognize these silent dangers means you are no longer a passive participant in them. You are no longer sleepwalking through psychic contracts made in your blind spots. You are awake, and from this place you can begin to live, not merely react, to create, not merely survive, to walk forward not as a role, but as a soul, whole, awake, and finally, free. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion